Batman 1989. Some people have gone back and said this movie actually sucked, and I can go back and say, yes, it does have flaws, but in my opinion, it has a perfect balance of goofiness and darkness, which is a very hard feat to do. I think we can all agree that Tim Burton really shines when it comes to set design. This movie looks fucking beautiful. It has a great comic book vibe to it, and I just love movies like that. The performances and characters are great. I love Jack Nicholson as the Joker, and I love Michael Keaton as Batman. But the reason why this movie is pretty low on the list is because the story's kinda weird. I guess weird's not the right word, but it's just kinda stupid. I think Jack Nicholson could have been fleshed out a little bit more as the Joker. We do get that with Michael Keaton's Batman though. And he's the main hero of the story, so it makes sense he had the main focus. The action in this movie is okay, but the cinematography is fantastic. I love a lot of the shots in this movie. And of course, Dan Elfman's score of Batman, which is probably the best Batman theme to date. Due to the plot, this movie isn't really a solid film, but I still really love it. 300. I remember when I was like 10 years old and my grandpa showed me this movie. And of course I fucking loved it. It had action, it was over the top.
Titties.
It was just an overall really badass film. Now, because of movies like 300, I'm starting to slowly become a Zack Snyder fan. I recently saw this and I'm like, oh yeah, he makes good movies. And then I went back to Batman vs Superman, I'm like, you know what, this movie isn't that bad. Yeah, Batman vs Superman has a lot of stupid shit in it, but it also has really cool moments as well, such as Batman vs those thugs. Getting back to 300 though. The Battle of Thermopylae is one of my favorite historical events because I just think it's just a really cool battle. And this movie is basically an over-the-top version of that battle. But by far my favorite thing about this film is the fact it's told from the perspective as if it's a storybook. And of course, the dialogue from the narration is really good. It's also a plus to have Cersei Lannister in your movie. I think this movie is a little bit more than just a simple, over-the-top action film because it has style. And I wish Zack Snyder went back to making films like this. And no, I don't mean an unnecessary sequel. SpiderMan 1. Again, another over-the-top goofy movie, but it has so much charm and just genuine thought put into it. You can't help but love it. And to be honest, I prefer my movies to be more over the top and have more comic book vibe than, well, I hate to say this, but MCU humor. What I mean by that is that MCU movies tend to be more self-aware of how silly they are, and it's getting to the point where they're making fun of it, which isn't really fun to watch. But Spider-Man 1 embraces this concept, the silliness concept, tenfold. I go back and watch some of these clips sometimes because that goofy charm in the movies is just so likable. And of course you have Willem Dafoe's performance as Green Goblin, which is, in my opinion, one of the best villains in any comic book movie. This is a very solid film, it knows what it wants to be, and it just wants to be over-the-top goofy. Iron Man. This one kind of hurts because Iron Man 2 sucks and Iron Man 3 is just okay at best. Also, as each MCU movie featuring Iron Man progresses throughout the MCU timeline, it seems like the suit gets worse and worse in terms of special effects. In this movie, it looks amazing. Because for the first suit, they use a practical effect, which is actual armor, and then for the second suit, they spend a lot of time on it and use a lot of practical effects as well. He's not just covered in computer-generated armor. It looks authentic and real, and it just gives the movie more life, in my opinion. Also, Iron Man was at his best in this film. I think afterwards he became a little bit lame. Like in Iron Man 3 they have Tony quit, and then in the Avengers movie you have him flying around in his suit. That is stupid. Here, he was consistent. I think a good reason why this film is so good is because, well, it wasn't trying to connect with the MCU universe. It was just being its own thing. The movie Iron Man is all about Tony Stark and his development throughout the film. And it is perfect. It's also somewhat grounded and realistic. Watching him go from a greedy billionaire who sells weapons to warmongers without a care, to someone who grows a conscience is pretty interesting. And yeah, the third act is kinda meh. I don't think it's horrible like some people say, but yeah, it's not as strong as the first two acts. Still a very good film though. Batman Begins. Yeah, you're gonna see a lot of Batman films on this list because not only is he my favorite superhero, but I feel like he has the best movies. Because the writers and directors of these films have a lot to work with. This character is a gift. There's so much that can go into these movies, and I feel like Christopher Nolan just nailed it with his trilogy. Well, maybe Dark Knight Rises is kinda eh. I mean, I still think it's like pretty decent, which is acceptable, and I think the trilogy overall is really solid. It's kinda like Return of the Jedi, like there's some dumb stuff, but it's overall a good film, in my opinion. And Batman Begins is the movie that started this trilogy, and they fucking nail it. Bruce Wayne was the strongest in this film, out of all the movies, because in the other two movies, you have Joker and Two-Face and Dark Knight, and they pretty much steal the show away from Batman, and Bane, in my opinion, is one of the best villains in the trilogy. So he also stole the show from Batman, but I don't really blame the writers or even Christopher Nolan for that because, well, Batman has the best villains. So it was pretty much bound to happen. I mean, Ra's al Ghul and Scarecrow are good villains, but I feel like Batman was still stronger than them. One nitpick I do have of this film is that the action is kind of meh. Christopher Nolan does that dumb shaky camera he likes to do when he makes his fights look realistic, and you don't know what the fuck's happening in the shot, so that's kind of annoying. Other than that, it's a decent film. Joker. Let me just go ahead and say this. It's a good movie. I really like it. But as I said in that podcast with my buddy, That One Filmmaker, it doesn't really feel like a Joker movie. Arthur Fleck doesn't really feel like the Joker. It just seems like some psychotic, sad dude. And yes, I know it's deeper than that, but you can make this a completely different character and people will be like, okay, yeah, I can see how that's not the Joker, because he does have certain character attributes where it seems like he's a completely different character. There are some moments where he has a Joker type personality. I love the fact that he's dancing down the stairs to rock music. I think that's a very Joker-like character trait. Shining some fun and light into a very dark and depressing moment. But even with that critique, Arthur Fleck is still a really good character. And despite what Chunk Yogurt says, he's not an incel you just sympathize with. He feels like a real, very mentally ill person. And of course, Joaquin Phoenix's performance was outstanding. Even people who didn't like this movie loved his performance. Robert De Niro was great as always. One other problem I do have with this film, though, is that it seemed to get too sad and depressing at some moments, like almost as if it was unrealistic. And this comic book movie is trying to be realistic, and I don't have a problem with that, but you just gotta keep the tone consistent. Even with these flaws, this is still one of my favorite films of 2019. And while it does take some things from Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, it's still its own thing. It's got its own different style, its own different characters and plot. I feel like there's more going into this movie than people let on. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I've never read the comic books, I've never played the video game, but this movie kind of makes me want to do both. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is my type of humor, or at least it's the type of humor I like. It's very dry and very subtle, and it also has a lot of over-the-top moments, which I love. In terms of actions and expressions, this film is very self-aware, but at the same time they embrace the goofiness, which I respect a lot. And this was also back when Brie Larson was likable. Holy shit. I really have no issues with this movie at all. I can't think of one flaw off the top of my head. Every single character in this film is memorable. They may not be likable, but they're memorable, which I think is very important. Nothing in this film is boring. I can guarantee you, if you don't like the style or the characters or whatever, I can understand that, but I have never heard or seen anyone say this film is dull. And I don't think anyone can deny the soundtrack is amazing. Black Sheep is a song I could just listen to by itself. It doesn't need context behind it. Overall, I'm in love with this film. It's one of a kind. V for Vendetta. Another comic book movie that has style. The best way I could describe it is a good version of those really bad superhero movies in the early 2000s. Like, just think of the style in Daredevil, but good. Honestly, I don't know how else to describe it. I just love how this movie is shot, how it looks, and how it presents itself. The dialogue in this film is something to appreciate. It's witty and memorable. And this is all possible mainly because of V's character. He's honestly one of my favorite cinematic characters of all time. He's just fucking cool. Yes, he seems unstoppable, but he's not a Gary Stu. He makes a huge decision in this movie he later on regrets. Because, he has an actual character. I think the plot is also something to appreciate. It focuses not only on the story, but also on world building, which is a great addition to have. I mean, yeah, we've seen films with a futuristic, totalitarian government, but I don't know, something about this one is just kind of interesting, and I want to do more research on it. Nothing more I can say, but overall a great film. SpiderMan II. Now, compared to Spider-Man 1, this one has more depth, but at the same time, it lacks a better villain. I think Green Goblin is just so good, it's hard to replace him. And don't get me wrong, Dr. Octopus is a good villain, but I've said this before, but I don't think his character is on the same level as the movie as a whole. Because the Peter Parker vs. Spider-Man dilemma is so much better. That's what makes this movie. It's realistic and over-the-top goofiness at the same time. Shit, we might need a counter for every time I say over the top. It's probably because of the type of comic book movies I usually like. But anyways, good villain, but not on the same par as the movie as a whole. So what makes the rest of the movie really good? Peter Parker feels like a real hero, but a real human being at the same time. He is so freaking likable in this film. I mean, yeah, they had the addition of having him be an underdog, which, you know, usually makes the protagonist feel likable, but they do more with just making him an underdog. There's just a lot of heart and genuine passion put into this film as a whole. I mean, one-scene characters like the pizza guy, random citizens who don't even have names, I remember all of them. That is a really hard feat to accomplish. When you recognize random background characters, you know you've made a film with great characters overall. Sometimes. Maybe the main character could be so boring you're just paying attention to the background characters, but that's not at all the case here. Because Peter is a very strong character. Plot is solid, cinematography is solid, action is fantastic, and this is one of those movies you can go back and watch it for its goofiness alone. Spider-Man II is a lot like a Star Wars prequel. There's a lot of memeable material in the film, so it has a lot of rewatch value. The Dark Knight, yes, this is an obvious choice, but nothing has beat it so far. It is a perfect film. As much as I love talking about over-the-top films and how much I love them, I respect this film so much because they took a superhero concept that could be seen as silly and made it grounded and realistic. That's fucking hard. Like, so many superhero films have tried to be grounded and realistic even though they have an over-the-top hero, and they fail massively because it is super hard to take this silly concept and turn it into something serious, completely flipping the tones. And yes, Batman is a dark superhero, but he's still a grown man in a bat costume fighting thugs and bad guys. It's kind of silly when you think about it, but watching this film, I completely forget about the silly concept and just focus on how great this film is. It feels real, and I think most of that has to do with Christopher Nolan trying his best to use only practical effects, which does overall make the movie seem more authentic. Joker is hands down one of my favorite cinematic characters of all time, probably number one, and I don't feel like I need to even explain why he's such a great character because so many people have explained why this is one of the best villains of all time. Something I will talk about though is Two-Face, who I think is incredibly underrated, and obviously it's because Heath Ledger nailed it with Joker. But I think Aaron Eckhart is almost as good as a villain as Joker, possibly even equal. I think they should have introduced Aaron Eckhart in the first film and it would have made his character more impactful. I think that's another reason why he gets looked over. And yeah, I agree, it would have been more impactful if the character was introduced in the first film, so we had more familiarity with him. And to be honest, my favorite scene in the film is at the end where Two-Face is about to shoot Jim Gordon's kid. It's very intense, very well acted. You have Gary Oldman, Christian Bale, and Aaron Eckhart in one scene, and they are acting their hearts out. Everyone put a lot of heart and soul in this film, and it shows. I don't feel like I need to explain anymore because everyone already knows why this is one of the best films ever made.